The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Windsor Castle as Sergeant Thomas Mitchell adjusted. At 28 years old, he had served as a Queen's Guard for 6 years. Following in the footsteps of his father, who had held the same position for over 2 decades before retiring, the tradition meant everything to Thomas, especially now that his father was no longer there to share stories about their shared duty. Thomas, standing motionless for hours, enduring all weather conditions, and maintaining perfect discipline while tourists snapped photos and occasionally tried to provoke reactions. It was all part of the job he loved. The red uniform represented centuries of British military tradition, and wearing it connected him to generations of soldiers who had served the crown with honor and dedication. On this particular Tuesday morning in late September, the castle grounds buzzed with the usual mix of international visitors. Tour groups moved in clusters, cameras clicking constantly as guides shared historical facts about the ancient fortress. Thomas took his position at the main gate, rifle at his shoulder, eyes fixed straight ahead in the traditional stance that had become second nature to him. The first few hours passed without incident. Children pressed their faces against the iron railings. Parents lifted toddlers for better views, and teenagers posed for selfies at respectful distances. Thomas had learned to tune out most of the chatter, though he remained alert to any potential security concerns. His training had taught him to distinguish between harmless tourist curiosity and genuine threats. Around midday, a group of American tourists approached the gate area. Most seemed respectful, maintaining appropriate distance while taking photographs and speaking in hushed tones about the pageantry they were witnessing. Among them, however, was a middle-aged man whose behavior immediately stood out. Unlike his companions, who showed reverence for the ceremony, this visitor seemed determined to treat the entire experience as personal entertainment. The man, wearing an expensive-looking camera around his neck and designer clothing that screamed affluence, began making increasingly loud comments about what he perceived as the absurdity of the Guard tradition. His voice carried across the courtyard as he mocked the silly costumes and pointless ceremony to anyone within earshot. Other tourists began glancing uncomfortably in his direction, clearly embarrassed by his behavior. Thomas remained perfectly still, his face expressionless despite the growing disturbance. Years of training had prepared him for exactly this type of situation. Guards were expected to maintain their composure regardless of provocation, and Thomas had developed an almost superhuman ability to ignore even the most obnoxious behavior from visitors. The tourists seemed frustrated by Thomas's lack of reaction. He began moving closer to the guard position, his comments becoming more personal and aggressive. He criticized everything from the uniform to the perceived waste of taxpayer money. On what he called medieval theater, his wife tugged at his sleeve, clearly mortified by his behavior, but he brushed off her attempts to quiet him as the man's rant continued. Thomas found his mind drifting to memories of his father, Colonel James Mitchell, who had passed away just 3 months earlier after a brief battle with cancer. James had been Thomas's hero, the reason he had chosen military service, and the inspiration behind his decision to join the Queen's Guard, even during his final days in the hospital. James had spoken with pride about the honor of serving the crown and the importance of maintaining dignity in the face of adversity. The grieving process had been difficult for Thomas. Losing his father so suddenly had left him struggling with emotions he wasn't accustomed to expressing. Military training emphasized stoicism and emotional control, but the loss of such an important figure in his life had created cracks in his usually impenetrable composure. He had returned to duty perhaps too soon, using the familiar routine and discipline as a way to cope with his grief. Standing in the afternoon sun, listening to this tourist's increasingly offensive commentary, Thomas felt the familiar weight of his father's memory. James had often told him stories about dealing with difficult visitors during his own years of service. "Son," he would say, "the uniform represents something bigger than any one person's opinion. We stand for tradition, for service, for something that transcends the moment. Never let anyone diminish that." The disrespectful tourist seemed to sense that his general mockery wasn't having the desired effect. So he began searching for more specific targets for his ridicule. He started making comments about the guards' families, their intelligence, and their life choices. The small crowd that had gathered began dispersing. Uncomfortable with the increasingly hostile atmosphere the man was creating, Thomas's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as the insults became more personal. Other guards nearby remained equally stoic, but there was a subtle tension in the air that suggested everyone was aware of the escalating situation. The man's wife had given up trying to restrain him and had moved away. Clearly wanting to distance herself from her husband's behavior, security personnel began taking notice of the disturbance. Moving closer to the area while trying to remain inconspicuous, they were trained to intervene if situations became genuinely threatening. But protocol required allowing guards to handle most verbal provocations through their disciplined non-response. The system usually worked perfectly. Most troublemakers eventually grew bored when their attempts at provocation failed. This tourist, however, seemed different. Rather than losing interest when his initial attempts failed, he appeared energized by what he interpreted as a challenge. He began researching new angles of attack, studying Thomas's face for any sign of reaction, any crack in the professional facade that might indicate vulnerability as the afternoon wore on. Thomas found himself thinking more about his father's teachings. James had always emphasized that being a Queen's Guard wasn't just about standing still and looking impressive for tourists. It was about representing the best of British military tradition, about maintaining dignity under pressure, and about serving something greater than oneself. The moment you let someone's ignorance affect your duty, James used to say, is the moment you dishonor everyone who wore the uniform before you. The tourist's behavior continued to escalate, drawing disapproving looks from other visitors and causing some families to move their children away from the area. His comments became increasingly crude and personal, though still not crossing the line that would require official intervention. He seemed to understand exactly where the boundaries lay and was skilled at pushing right up against them without going far enough to face consequences. Thomas remained motionless, his breathing steady, his gaze fixed straight ahead. Inside, however, he was fighting a battle between his professional training and his human emotions. The grief over his father's death was still raw, still close to the surface, and this stranger's relentless mockery was probing wounds that hadn't yet healed. The afternoon sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting longer shadows across the ancient stones of Windsor Castle. Thomas knew his shift would end in a few hours, but time seemed to move slowly as the verbal assault continued. He focused on his breathing, on the feel of his uniform, on the weight of tradition that rested on his shoulders. Other tourists continued to arrive. As the clock tower chimed for in the afternoon, the persistent tourists seemed to be running out of general insults and began searching for more specific ammunition. He pulled out his smartphone and started taking photos of Thomas from various angles, making exaggerated poses and crude gestures that drew uncomfortable stares from other visitors. The man's behavior had reached a level of obnoxiousness that was causing genuine distress, too. Families trying to enjoy their visit to the historic castle. Thomas maintained his professional composure, but inside, he was struggling more than usual. The raw grief from his father's recent death made him more vulnerable to emotional triggers than he had been in previous years of service. Every mocking comment seemed to echo with a cruel irony. Here he was, trying to honor his father's memory through continued service. While this stranger treated that service as a joke, the tourist's wife had completely abandoned him by this point, walking away to join a different tour group rather than be associated with his behavior. Her departure seemed to liberate him further, as if her presence had been the last restraint on his conduct. He began speaking louder, clearly hoping to attract a larger audience for his performance. "Look at this ridiculous display," the man announced to no one in particular, gesturing broadly at Thomas. "Grown men playing dress-up with toy soldiers' uniforms. What kind of person chooses to spend their life standing around like a statue for tourists to gawk at? I bet their families are so proud," he added with heavy sarcasm. The comment about family hit Thomas like a physical blow. His father had indeed been proud, incredibly proud of Thomas's service and of their shared tradition. James Mitchell had spoken about his son's achievements to anyone who would listen, right up until his final days in the hospital. The idea that anyone could mock that pride, that dedication, stirred something deep and painful in Thomas's chest. Other guards stationed nearby were also showing subtle signs of tension, while they maintained their disciplined postures. There were small indicators, slightly clenched jaws, almost imperceptible shifts in breathing patterns that suggested the tourist's behavior was testing everyone's professional limits. The guards all knew each other well, had trained together, and had developed an almost telepathic awareness of each other's emotional states during challenging situations. A group of British schoolchildren on an educational field trip had stopped to observe the guards, their teacher explaining the historical significance of the tradition. The tourist immediately seized on this new audience, raising his voice even more as he continued his disparaging commentary. The teacher looked increasingly uncomfortable, clearly wanting to move her students away from the negative atmosphere the man was creating. Children, the tourist addressed the school group directly, ignoring the teacher's obvious displeasure. You're looking at a perfect example of how some people waste their lives. These men could be doing something useful, but instead they choose to play make-believe soldier for tourists. What do you think their parents told them when they announced they wanted to grow up to be living mannequins? Thomas felt his hands tremble slightly on his rifle. The mention of parents combined with the dismissive tone about military service created a perfect storm of emotional triggers. His father had never seen military service as make-believe or playing dress-up. James Mitchell had viewed their shared calling as one of the highest forms of service to country and crown, a tradition that connected them to centuries of British military heritage. The teacher quickly ushered her students away from the area, shooting an apologetic look toward the guards as she led the children toward a different part of the castle grounds. Her departure left the tourist with a smaller audience, but he seemed undeterred. If anything, the public nature of his previous comments seemed to have energized him further. Security personnel were now openly monitoring the situation. Castle protocols were clear about when intervention was appropriate, and verbal harassment that didn't cross specific lines was considered part of the job that guards were expected to handle through their trained non-response. The system relied on troublemakers, eventually growing bored and moving on when their provocations failed to generate reactions. This particular individual seemed different, however. Rather than losing interest, he appeared to be treating the guard's silence as encouragement to escalate further. He began circling Thomas's position like a predator, looking for any sign of weakness or vulnerability that he could exploit for his entertainment. I wonder what kind of tragic life story leads someone to this point, the man mused aloud, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. Did Daddy abandon you? Did Mommy not love you enough? Or maybe Daddy was a military man too, and you're just following in his pathetic footsteps, thinking that standing around in a costume somehow makes you important. The words hit Thomas like bullets. The casual, dismissive reference to his father, to Daddy, sent shockwaves through his carefully maintained emotional control. James Mitchell hadn't been pathetic. He had been a decorated soldier, a loving father, and a man who had devoted his life to service and honor. The idea that this stranger could so carelessly mock that legacy was almost unbearable. Thomas's breathing became slightly more labored, though he fought to keep it controlled. His hands gripped his rifle more tightly, for the first time since the harassment began. He felt the dangerous stirring of genuine anger rather than mere professional frustration. The grief that had been his constant companion since his father's death, suddenly transformed into something more volatile. The tourist seemed to sense that he had struck a nerve. Like a shark detecting blood in the water, he pressed his advantage, moving closer to Thomas and lowering his voice to a more personal, intimate level of cruelty. Oh, I think I hit a nerve there. Let me guess. Daddy really was a soldier, wasn't he? And now, poor little boy is trying to live up to Daddy's memory by playing soldier himself. How tragically pathetic. Other tourists in the area were now openly staring at the confrontation, some pulling out phones to record what was happening. The situation was attracting exactly the kind of attention that castle security wanted to avoid. But the protocols still didn't permit direct intervention unless the harassment became physically threatening or crossed clearly defined verbal boundaries. Thomas could feel sweat beginning to form under his heavy uniform. Despite the cooling afternoon air, His father's face appeared clearly in his mind, not as he had been during those final difficult weeks in the hospital, but as Thomas remembered him from childhood, strong, proud, wearing his own uniform with dignity and explaining to his young son what it meant to serve something greater than yourself. Service isn't about personal glory. James had told him many times. It's about being part of something that will continue long after we're gone. Every generation has to pass the torch to the next, and that torch represents honor, duty, and sacrifice. When you wear the uniform, you carry the hopes and dreams of everyone who wore it before you. The tourist was still circling, still probing for reactions, clearly energized by what he perceived as progress in breaking down Thomas's professional composure. His comments became increasingly personal and vicious, as if he had decided that completely humiliating one of the guards would be the perfect souvenir from his visit to Windsor Castle. I bet, Daddy, I told you all sorts of noble stories about military service. Didn't he? The man continued, his voice now barely above a whisper, but still audible to Thomas and the gathering crowd. Did he fill your head with fairy tales about honor and duty? Did he convince you that standing around like an ornament was somehow meaningful? What would he think if he could see you now, being mocked by tourists and not even having the spine to defend yourself? Thomas felt something crack inside his chest. The image of his father, the memory of their last conversation in the hospital, the weight of 3 months of suppressed grief, it all suddenly pressed against his professional training with crushing force. The tourist had clearly decided that he was on the verge of a breakthrough. Sensing what he interpreted as weakness in Thomas's momentary eye closure, he pressed his attack with renewed vigor. His voice grew more confident, more cruel, as if he had discovered the exact formula for breaking down the guard's professional facade. "This is getting interesting," the man announced to the growing crowd of onlookers. "I think our toy soldier here is actually feeling something." "What's wrong, son? Did I hit too close to home talking about your daddy?" "Let me guess. He's probably gone now, isn't he? Dead and buried. And here you are trying to honor his memory by standing around like a scarecrow?" The words hung in the air like poison. Several tourists gasped audibly at the cruelty of the comment, and even some who had been recording the confrontation lowered their phones, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the harassment had taken. A few people in the crowd began murmuring disapprovingly, but the tourist seemed oblivious to the negative reaction he was generating among other visitors. Thomas felt his world narrow to a single point of focus. The sounds of the castle grounds, the distant chatter of other tour groups, the clicking of cameras, the footsteps on cobblestones, all faded into background noise. His father's death, which he had been trying so hard to process through the familiar routine of duty, suddenly felt as raw and immediate as if it had happened yesterday. Colonel James Mitchell had indeed been buried just 3 months ago. On a rainy Tuesday morning at the military cemetery, Thomas had stood at attention beside the grave, watching as his father's flag-draped coffin was lowered into the earth. The 21-gun salute had echoed across the grounds, and when they presented Thomas with the folded flag, he had struggled to maintain his composure in front of his grieving mother and extended family. The funeral had been attended by dozens of James's former colleagues and fellow guardsmen, all sharing stories about his decades of distinguished service. Speaker after speaker had talked about James's integrity, his dedication to tradition, and his pride in his son's continuation of the family legacy. It had been both heartbreaking and inspiring, a celebration of a life dedicated to something greater than personal ambition. Now, standing in the afternoon shadows at Windsor Castle, Thomas felt the weight of that folded flag, which sat in a place of honor on his mantelpiece at home. Every morning before leaving for duty, he paused to look at it, drawing strength from what it represented. The idea that this stranger could mock his father's sacrifice, could treat James's death as ammunition for cruel entertainment, was almost unbearable. The tourist seemed to interpret Thomas's continued silence as confirmation that he had found the perfect target. His smile grew wider, more predatory, as he prepared to deliver what he clearly believed would be the killing blow to the guard's composure. "Tell you what," the man said, pulling out his smartphone and holding it up as if preparing to record. "Why don't you break character for just a minute and tell us all about your dead daddy?" I bet he'd be so proud to see his little boy being humiliated by a tourist and not even having the courage to respond. Some soldier he must have raised. The crowd around them had grown considerably, drawn by the obvious drama playing out before them. Most faces showed disgust at the tourists' behavior, but a few seemed grimly fascinated by the psychological torture they were witnessing. Security personnel had moved noticeably closer, clearly prepared to intervene if the situation escalated beyond verbal harassment. Thomas found himself thinking about the last coherent conversation he had shared with his father in the hospital. James had been weak from chemotherapy, but still mentally sharp, still concerned about his son's well-being despite his own deteriorating condition. "Promise me something," Thomas, his father, had whispered, gripping his son's hand with what remained of his strength. "Promise me that you'll remember why we do this. It's not about the tourists or the cameras or what people think. It's about being part of something that's bigger than any one person. When you put on that uniform, you're carrying forward everything that matters about duty and honor and service," Thomas had promised, fighting back tears as he watched his hero struggle with the reality of his mortality. James had smiled then, a weak but genuine expression of pride and love. "I know you'll do the right thing, son. You always have. The uniform doesn't make the man makes the uniform worthy." Those had been among James's final lucid words. Within a week, he had slipped into a coma from which he never awakened. Thomas had been with him at the end, holding his hand as the machines that had been keeping him alive were finally turned off. The last sound James heard was his son's voice, promising once again to honor their shared tradition. The memory strengthened Thomas's resolve, even as the tourist's words cut deeper. His father had faced enemy fire during his overseas deployments, had endured years of difficult conditions and challenging assignments, and had maintained his dignity through it all. James Mitchell had never once compromised his principles or his duty. No matter what pressures he faced, "I'm talking to you." "Statue boy," the tourist said, waving his phone more aggressively near Thomas's face. "Don't you have anything to say about your pathetic dead father? Or are you going to just stand there and let me mock his memory without even trying to defend him? What kind of son are you?" Something fundamental shifted in Thomas's expression. While he maintained his forward gaze and military posture, observers who were watching carefully noticed a subtle change in his bearing. His shoulders seemed to settle more firmly, his jaw set with new determination, and his grip on his rifle adjusted almost imperceptibly. The tourist mistook this change for capitulation. As if he believed he had finally succeeded in completely breaking down the guard's professional composure, he began speaking even louder, playing to his audience of uncomfortable onlookers who were becoming increasingly disgusted with his behavior. "Ladies and gentlemen," the man announced in a theatrical voice, "witness the proud tradition of the British military soldiers. So well-trained that they can't even defend their own father's honor when challenged by a simple tourist. I wonder what this dead hero would think about his son's complete lack of spine." The crowd's reaction was immediate and negative. People began openly expressing their disapproval, with some calling for security intervention and others simply walking away in disgust. A few tourists started taking pictures of the harassing man rather than the guards. Clearly intending to document his shameful behavior rather than celebrate it, Thomas drew a slow, deep breath, centering himself in a way that his father had taught him during their early training sessions together. James had always emphasized that a soldier's greatest strength came not from anger or aggression, but from absolute clarity of purpose and unshakable commitment to doing what was right. "Remember," son James had said during one of their long talks about military service, "there will come times when you have to choose between what's easy and what's right. The uniform gives you the strength to make the right choice, but only if you remember what it truly represents. We don't serve for personal glory or recognition. We serve because someone has to stand guard over the things that matter." The tourist was still ranting, still trying to provoke a reaction, still using Thomas's father's memory as a weapon for his own entertainment. But something had changed in the dynamic. While Thomas remained outwardly motionless, there was a gathering sense of purpose about him, as if he was preparing not for breakdown but for something entirely different. The afternoon sun continued its descent toward the horizon, casting longer shadows across the ancient stones of Windsor Castle. The confrontation had been going on for over an hour now, far longer than most such incidents lasted. Security personnel exchanged glances, clearly discussing whether the situation had progressed beyond normal protocols. Thomas thought once more about the folded flag on his mantelpiece, about the pride in his father's voice during their final conversation, about the generations of soldiers who had worn the same uniform with honor and dignity. The tourist's words had been intended to wound and humiliate, but they were having an unexpected effect. Instead of breaking Thomas down, the cruel mockery was crystallizing his understanding of exactly why his father's legacy mattered so much, and why defending that legacy was worth whatever professional consequences might follow. The moment of truth was rapidly approaching, and when it came, everyone present would understand the real meaning of honor, duty, and a son's love for his father. The tourist had worked himself into a frenzy of cruel entertainment, completely oblivious to the shifting mood of the crowd around him. His voice had grown hoarse from the extended verbal assault, but his enthusiasm for psychological torture seemed undiminished. He circled Thomas like a vulture, searching for new angles of attack while his smartphone continued recording what he apparently believed was his triumph over British military discipline. "You know what I think happened?" the man continued, his voice taking on a mockingly sympathetic tone that was somehow even more offensive than his previous direct attacks. "I think Daddy probably died disappointed in you. I bet he spent his final days wondering how he could have raised such a weak son. Someone who would choose to waste his life playing dress-up instead of doing something meaningful with his existence." The words hit Thomas like physical blows, but they also served to clarify something that had been building inside him throughout the ordeal. His father had not died disappointed, quite the opposite. James Mitchell's final words had been expressions of pride and love, confident assertions that his son would continue their shared tradition with honor and dignity. Thomas began to speak, his voice quiet but carrying clearly across the suddenly silent courtyard. Every person in the crowd leaned forward, straining to hear the first words the guard had uttered during the entire confrontation. Even the tourist stopped his circling, surprised that his verbal assault had finally provoked a response. "My father," Thomas said, his voice steady and calm despite the emotional storm raging inside him, "was Colonel James Mitchell of the Queen's Guard. He served his country for 27 years with distinction, honor, and unwavering dedication to duty. He deployed to Northern Ireland during the Troubles, served 2 tours in Afghanistan, and spent the final decade of his career in this very position. Standing where I stand now." The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. The tourist stood frozen, his smartphone still recording but his confident smirk beginning to falter as he realized that his victim was not breaking down in the way he had expected. Thomas continued, his gaze still fixed straight ahead but his voice growing stronger. "3 months ago, I held his hand as he died from cancer. His final words to me were about duty, about honor, and about the pride he felt knowing that our family's tradition of service would continue through me. He died knowing that he had raised a son who understood what it means to serve something greater than himself." The tourist tried to interrupt, sensing that the dynamic of the confrontation was shifting in ways he hadn't anticipated, but Thomas's voice rose slightly, cutting through his attempted interjection with quiet authority. "You speak of my father as if you knew him, as if you understood what kind of man he was. But you understand nothing. You see only a uniform, only what you perceive as pageantry for tourists. You cannot comprehend the sacrifice, the dedication, the generations of men and women who have stood in these positions, not for recognition or applause, but because they believed in something worth protecting." Several people in the crowd were now openly weeping, moved by the raw emotion and dignity in Thomas's response. The tourist's wife, who had rejoined the group after her earlier departure, looked mortified by her husband's behavior and the pain he had caused. Thomas's voice took on a deeper resonance as he continued, drawing from reserves of strength that his father's training had built within him. "Colonel James Mitchell taught me that the uniform we wear represents every soldier who came before us and every one who will come after. When you mock this tradition, you mock not just me, but generations of men and women who have given their lives in service to their country and their crown." The tourist clearly rattled by the unexpected eloquence and power of Thomas's response, tried to regain his earlier momentum. "Oh, please," he said, though his voice lacked its previous confidence, "spare me the patriotic speech. It's still just grown men playing soldier for the entertainment of tourists. Your dead father's delusions don't make this charade anymore. It's meaningful." The renewed attack on his father's memory seemed to unlock something even deeper in Thomas's resolve. He turned his head slightly, making direct eye contact with the tourist for the first time since the harassment began. The movement was subtle but electric, causing a ripple of anticipation through the watching crowd. "You want to know what my father would think about this moment?" Thomas asked, his voice now carrying a tone of quiet authority that commanded absolute attention from everyone present. He would be proud that his son chose to respond not with anger or violence, but with the truth about what service really means. Thomas took a step forward, still maintaining perfect military bearing, but now directly engaging with his tormentor. The tourist instinctively stepped back, suddenly seeming smaller and less confident in the face of the guard's quiet. "Dignity. My father served in combat zones where better men than you have died protecting the freedoms you take for granted," Thomas continued. "He faced real enemies, not tourists with cameras and cruel tongues. He taught me that true strength comes not from the ability to hurt others, but from the discipline to protect what matters even when faced with those who would mock or destroy it." The crowd began to murmur appreciatively, clearly moved by Thomas's words and disgusted by the contrast between his dignity and the tourist's cruelty. Some people started applauding softly, showing their support for the young guard, who was defending not just his father's memory, but the honor of his entire profession. The tourist seemed to realize that he was rapidly losing whatever audience he had hoped to entertain. His smartphone trembled slightly in his hand as he struggled to regain the initiative in a confrontation that had spiraled completely beyond his control. "He would be proud," Thomas said, his voice rising to ensure that everyone in the courtyard could hear him clearly, "that when faced with someone who chose to use his death as a weapon, I responded by sharing the truth about the kind of man he was and the values he represented. He would be proud that I chose to honor his memory not with anger, but with the same dignity and grace that he showed throughout his life and service." Security personnel, who had been preparing to intervene, now stood at a respectful distance, recognizing that something profound was happening that transcended their normal protocols. This was no longer a simple case of tourist harassment requiring official response. It had become a moment of genuine human connection and moral clarity. The tourist made one final attempt to regain control of the situation, raising his smartphone higher as if the act of recording would somehow restore his psychological advantage. "Well, isn't this touching?" he said, though his voice cracked slightly with uncertainty. The tin soldier finally found his voice. "Too bad Daddy isn't here to see his little boy's speech." Thomas smiled then, expression of such genuine warmth and peace that it seemed to transform his entire bearing. "But you're wrong about that too," he said softly. "My father is here. He's in every word I've spoken, in every lesson he taught me, in every moment I've chosen dignity over anger. He's in this uniform, in this tradition, and in the knowledge that his legacy of service continues through me and through every guard who stands in these positions." The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause. Moved by Thomas's profound response to cruelty with grace and wisdom, the tourist stood isolated in the center of the appreciative audience, finally beginning to understand that his attempt at entertainment had backfired spectacularly. Rather than humiliating a guard, he had provided a platform for an extraordinary display of character and honor that would be remembered by everyone present. The confrontation was approaching its climax, but Thomas was no longer its victim. Through his response, Hea transformed a moment of potential humiliation into something else entirely, a testament to the power of dignity, the importance of honoring one's heritage, and the unbreakable bond between a father and son united in service to something greater than themselves. The applause from the crowd seemed to awaken something in the tourist that his earlier cruelty had suppressed, perhaps a flicker of conscience, or simply the dawning realization that he had misjudged the situation entirely. His smartphone hand dropped to his side, and for the first time since the confrontation began, he looked genuinely uncertain about his next move. Thomas, meanwhile, seemed to grow stronger with each passing moment. The grief and anger that had been eating away at him for 3 months were being transformed into something else, not the bitter resentment the tourist had tried to provoke, but a clear understanding of his purpose and a deep connection to his father's legacy. "You asked what kind of son I am?" Thomas continued, his voice now carrying across the entire courtyard with natural authority. "I am the son of a man who taught me that true strength comes from serving others, not from tearing them down. I am the son of a soldier who showed me that honor isn't something you display when it's easy, but something you hold on to when it's difficult." The tourist's wife approached her husband and grabbed his arm, clearly trying to extract him from a situation that had become deeply embarrassing for their entire family. Other members of their tour group had distanced themselves completely, some even removing their matching tour badges to avoid association with the man's behavior. "James," the woman whispered urgently, "we need to go now. This has gone too far." But Thomas wasn't finished. The words seemed to be flowing from some deep well of understanding that his father's death and this confrontation had somehow unlocked within him. He had found his voice not in anger, but in love. Love for his father, for his duty, and even for the tradition that this stranger had tried to mock. "My father died believing that the world still contained people who understood the difference between right and wrong, between service and selfishness, between building up and tearing down," Thomas said, his eyes never leaving the tourist's face. "He died believing that his sacrifice mattered, that his service meant something, that the values he fought to protect would live on through people who choose to do better." The tourist seemed to shrink under Thomas's steady gaze. What had begun as entertainment for him had become something far more serious, a moral reckoning that he was clearly unprepared to face. The cruel confidence that had carried him through the earlier harassment was crumbling in the face of Thomas's quiet dignity. "You want to know what my father would think about you?" Thomas asked, his voice softening but losing none of its power. "He would pity you. He would pity someone who traveled thousands of miles to one of the world's most beautiful and historic places, only to spend his time trying to cause pain to strangers. He would pity someone who looked at centuries of tradition and saw only an opportunity for mockery." The crowd around them had grown to include several dozen people, all standing in respectful silence as they witnessed this extraordinary moment. Many were recording now, but their cameras were focused on Thomas rather than the tourist, capturing not a moment of humiliation, but a demonstration of grace under pressure that would inspire viewers around the world. An elderly British veteran, recognizable by his regimental tie and bearing, stepped forward from the crowd. With tears in his eyes, he saluted Thomas sharply, holding the gesture for several long seconds before speaking in a voice that carried clearly across the courtyard. "Your father would be proud, lad," the veteran said simply. "Bloody proud indeed." The old soldier's words seemed to break whatever remained of the tourist's composure. He looked around at the faces surrounding him, some angry, some disappointed, but most simply sad at what they had witnessed. His wife tugged at his arm more insistently, and this time he allowed himself to be pulled away from the center of attention. But Thomas called out to him as he began to retreat, stopping him in his tracks with words that no one in the crowd would ever forget. "Wait," Thomas said, his voice carrying a tone of genuine concern rather than triumph. "Before you go, I want you to understand something. This isn't about winning or losing. This isn't about proving who's right or wrong. This is about remembering that every person you meet is fighting battles you know nothing about, carrying losses you can't imagine, holding on to hope in ways you might not recognize." The tourist turned back reluctantly, his face flushed with embarrassment and something that might have been shame. His smartphone hung forgotten in his hand, no longer recording what had become a very different kind of performance than he had intended to capture. Thomas continued, his voice growing gentler as he spoke directly to the man who had caused him so much pain. "My father died 3 months ago. I've been struggling with that loss every single day since then, wondering how to honor his memory, how to live up to the example he set. You couldn't have known that when you chose me as your target today. But now you do know. The admission of vulnerability shared so openly and honestly seemed to affect everyone present. Even the tourist's expression began to change. The cruel amusement replaced by something more complex and uncomfortable. I'm not telling you this to make you feel guilty, Thomas said. Though the words clearly were having that effect, I'm telling you this because I want you to understand what you were really attacking today. You weren't just mocking a guard in a funny costume. You were mocking a son's love for his father, a tradition that has given meaning to thousands of lives, in a form of service that has protected the freedoms. You exercised so casually, security personnel watched from their positions, no longer preparing to intervene, but simply bearing witness to an encounter that had transcended their normal protocols. This was no longer about maintaining order at a tourist attraction. It had become something deeper, more human. More important than any regulation could address, the tourist's wife released his arm and stepped back, leaving him to face Thomas's words alone. Her expression suggested that she was seeing her husband perhaps more clearly than she had in years, recognizing qualities in him that this moment had exposed to public view. You came here today as a tourist. Looking for entertainment, Thomas said, his voice now carrying a note of gentle instruction rather than confrontation. You found a target that seemed safe, someone who couldn't fight back, someone whose job required him to absorb your mockery in silence. But you didn't find entertainment, you found something else entirely. Thomas paused, letting his words settle over the silent courtyard before continuing. You found a mirror. And in that mirror, you saw exactly what kind of person you are when you think there are no consequences for cruelty. When you believe that someone else's pain can be your amusement, the tourist's hands were shaking now. Not with anger, but with what appeared to be genuine distress at the truth Thomas was laying bare before him and everyone present. His earlier confidence had completely evaporated, replaced by a dawning awareness of how his behavior appeared to others and to himself. My father taught me that every interaction we have with another person is a choice, Thomas said, his voice growing stronger as he approached his conclusion. We can choose to build up or tear down, to show compassion or cruelty, to recognize the humanity in others, or to treat them as objects for our entertainment. Today, you made a choice. I've made one too. The crowd waited in breathless silence for Thomas's final words, sensing that they were about to witness something that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the ancient stones, creating a natural theater for this moment of moral clarity and human connection. Thomas drew himself to his full height, every inch the professional soldier his father had raised him to be, but also something more, a young man who had found his voice and his purpose in the most unlikely of circumstances. Thomas looked directly at the tourist, and when he spoke again, his words carried a weight that seemed to reach into every heart present in the courtyard. I choose to forgive you, he said simply. Not because you deserve it, not because what you did was acceptable, but because my father taught me that forgiveness is not about the other person. It's about choosing who you want to be in the world. The tourist's face crumpled. The simple declaration of forgiveness, offered without conditions or demands for apology, seemed to break through whatever defenses he had been maintaining. For the first time since the confrontation began, he looked genuinely human rather than simply cruel. He also taught me, Thomas continued, that every person has the capacity to be better than their worst moment. You showed me your worst today, but I have to believe that somewhere inside you is someone who would be ashamed of what happened here. I have to believe that. Because the alternative that some people are simply cruel without hope of redemption is too dark to accept. Tears began streaming down several faces in the crowd. The elderly veteran who had saluted earlier was openly weeping, and even some of the security personnel were struggling to maintain their professional composure in the face of such extraordinary grace. The tourist tried to speak several times, his mouth opening and closing as if he were searching for words that wouldn't come. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, he managed to say, I don't understand. Why aren't you angry? Why aren't you trying to hurt me back?" Thomas smiled then, and the expression transformed his entire face. "Because anger would dishonor my father's memory. Because cruelty would make me like you were today. Because someone has to choose to be better. And I'd rather it be me." The tourist's wife stepped forward hesitantly, looking between her husband and Thomas with an expression of profound shame and gratitude. "I am so sorry," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "I am so deeply, deeply sorry for what he said about your father. No one deserves that kind of treatment, especially not someone who serves others the way you do." Thomas nodded acknowledgement of her apology, but his attention remained focused on her husband. "The question now," he said gently, "is what you do with this moment. You can walk away and pretend this never happened. Tell yourself that I'm just a naive soldier who doesn't understand the real world. Or you can let this be the moment when you decided to be better." The tourist was crying now, his body shaking with the force of emotions he was clearly unaccustomed to experiencing or expressing. The smartphone in his hand seemed forgotten, a relic of the person he had been just minutes earlier when his only concern was capturing his own entertainment. "I don't know how," he said through his tears. "I don't know how to be the person you think I could be. I've been angry for so long, taking it out on everyone around me. My wife, my children, strangers who never did anything to deserve it. I don't even remember why I'm so angry anymore." Thomas stepped closer. Close enough that only the tourist and his wife could hear his next words clearly. "My father used to say that anger is just grief that doesn't know where to go. Maybe you're carrying losses you've never let yourself mourn properly. Maybe you're hurting in ways you haven't admitted to yourself. That doesn't excuse what you did today, but it might explain it." The tourist looked up at Thomas with an expression of desperate hope, as if this young soldier might somehow hold the key to healing wounds he had been carrying for years. "Your father sounds like he was an incredible man. I can't imagine having that kind of wisdom, that kind of strength." "He was just a man," Thomas replied softly. "A man who made mistakes, who struggled with his own demons, who sometimes fell short of his own ideals. But he kept trying to do better, kept choosing compassion over bitterness, kept believing that service to others was the path to meaning. That's not superhuman, that's just human at its best." The crowd around them had remained respectfully quiet during this more intimate portion of the conversation, but they continued to bear witness to an extraordinary transformation taking place before their eyes. What had begun as a moment of cruelty was becoming something else entirely, a demonstration of the power of grace to change hearts and heal wounds. Security. Personnel exchanged glances, clearly recognizing that they were witnessing something far beyond their normal experience. This was no longer a situation requiring management or intervention. It had become a moment of genuine human connection that would be talked about for years to come. The tourist wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, leaving streaks across his face that made him look younger and more vulnerable. "I recorded the beginning of this," he said, holding up his phone. "I was going to post it online, show my friends how I made a British guard lose his composure. I thought it would be funny." Thomas nodded, unsurprised by the admission. "What will you do with that recording now?" The tourist looked at his phone for a long moment, then made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He deleted the file with deliberate slowness, making sure Thomas could see each step of the process. "I'm going to remember this day for the rest of my life," he said quietly. "But I'm not going to share my shame with the world. Some lessons are too important to cheapen with social media." Thomas extended his hand, offering it to the man who had spent the afternoon trying to destroy him. "My name is Thomas Mitchell. My father was Colonel James Mitchell. I'm honored to serve in his footsteps. I'm grateful that his lessons helped me handle this situation the way he would have wanted." The tourist stared at the offered hand for several seconds, as if afraid to believe that such grace was possible after what he had done. Finally, he reached out and shook it, his grip firm despite his trembling. "My name is Richard Chen. I'm from California, and I came here today as one person, but I'm leaving as someone else entirely. I don't know if I deserve your forgiveness, but I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to earn it." The handshake between the two men seemed to release something in the watching crowd. Spontaneous applause broke out again, but this time it was different, not the angry support of earlier, but genuine celebration of human transformation and the power of choosing grace over revenge as the crowd began to disperse. Many people approached Thomas to shake his hand, to thank him for his service, and to express their admiration for how he had handled the situation. The elderly veteran who had saluted earlier waited until last, then spent several minutes sharing stories about his own service, his respect for the tradition Thomas represented. Richard Chen and his wife remained nearby throughout these interactions, waiting patiently for a final moment with the young guard, which shown them both something profound about human nature and the possibility of redemption. When the crowd had thinned, Richard approached Thomas one final time. "I want you to know," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion behind his words, "that I'm going to tell my children about today. Not about the cruel things I said, but about how you responded to them. I want them to understand what real strength looks like, what real honor means. I want them to grow up to be more like you and less like the person I was this afternoon." Thomas smiled and nodded, then returned to his position at the gate, resuming the stance and bearing that had made him a target for mockery just hours earlier. But something fundamental had changed. The uniform he wore no longer felt like a burden he carried alone. It felt like a connection to his father, 2 centuries of tradition, and to the possibility that even in the darkest moments, choosing grace and dignity could transform both victim and perpetrator alike, as the sun set over Windsor Castle, painting the ancient stones in shades of gold and amber. Sergeant Thomas Mitchell stood at his post with renewed purpose and understanding. His father's death had been a devastating loss, but today had shown him that Colonel James Mitchell's greatest lesson was not about military bearing or professional duty. It was about the transformative power of responding to hatred with love, to cruelty with compassion, and to personal attacks with unwavering dignity.